Picture this. You are holding a document that fundamentally changes the identity of a global icon, only to realize the history you are taught is just full of these gaping, deliberate holes. Was the greatest writer in the English language actually a secret agent, an illegal wool smuggler, or perhaps someone else entirely? Welcome to Legendary Lives Unveiled. We have an absolute mountain of sources on the table in front of us today. We are looking at centuries-old legal leases, historical biographies, vicious theatrical records, sprawling authorship debates, and even digitized X-rays of a highly contested last will and testament. The goal today is to critically examine those exact blind spots in the historical record. If you are ready to shatter the marble statues and dive into the muddy, chaotic reality of the past, leave a like, subscribe to Legendary Lives Unveiled, and share this audio with the biggest history or literature nerd you know. When you say the name William Shakespeare, people immediately picture the bard with a capital B, the untouchable genius. But looking at these sources, before we can even begin to understand the literary god, we have to understand the muddy, chaotic reality of a small market town in the 16th century. The documentary trail officially starts in Stratford-upon-Avon, a bustling provincial hub, with a parish register noting his baptism on April 26, 1564. Traditionally, you see his birthday celebrated globally on April 23rd, which perfectly aligns with St. George's Day, the patron saint of England. Is there any historical backing for that specific date? None whatsoever. It is a romantic convention forged much later to tie his birth to the ultimate symbol of English national identity. The 3-day gap between birth and baptism was common, but pinning it exactly to the 23rd is pure retrospective myth-making. We are already inventing things from day one, but what is vastly more crucial to understanding his psychological development is the family he was born into. His father, John Shakespeare, is usually presented in children's books as this humble, hard-working glovemaker. But reading through the economic records, that humble glovemaker narrative is a massive understatement. It is basically fiction. John Shakespeare was an alderman and a bailiff, which is essentially the mayor, but he was also heavily involved in the shadow economy. The sources identify him as an illegal wool brogger. To understand this, you really have to understand that wool was the absolute backbone of the English economy at the time. It was their crude oil. Because it was so valuable, the crown heavily regulated it. The state set up monopolies in specific markets called staples, where wool had to be traded so the government could tax the exports heavily. A brogger was a middleman who bypassed this entire legal apparatus. John Shakespeare would ride out to the local sheep farmers, buy their wool directly for cash, store it secretly, and then sell it to clothiers or export smugglers at a massive markup. He completely dodged the state taxes and the monopoly restrictions, basically running an illicit textile empire out of his backyard. He wasn't just doing that. The court records show he was lending money at exorbitant interest rates, which was illegal under usury laws. We are looking at a man who was essentially a 16th century white-collar criminal, taking massive risks, dodging state inspectors, and leveraging debt. And eventually, he got caught. When William was around 12 or 13 years old, John Shakespeare's empire collapsed. He was targeted by informers, people who made a living reporting illegal broggers and usurers to the crown for a cut of the fines. John was hit with devastating financial penalties. He had to stop attending town council meetings. He mortgaged his wife's inherited properties and lost them, and was literally hiding from creditors indoors. If you put yourself in the shoes of a teenage William, watching your family go from the absolute pinnacle of local power to hiding indoors because men are coming to collect crippling debts, that has to rewire your brain. It shatters that image of the delicate, isolated artist plucking inspiration from the clouds. He comes from a family of gritty, ambitious hustlers who just flew way too close to the sun. The socioeconomic reality of that household forged a pragmatist. It forged a young man who intimately understood the mechanics of debt, the terror of social ruin, the intricacies of legal loopholes, and the absolute unforgiving necessity of making a profit. You do not survive that kind of childhood without becoming intensely focused on financial security. While his father's empire is crumbling, William is supposedly getting an education. We don't actually have an attendance record for him. The literal paper registers of the King's New School in Stratford did not survive the centuries. However, historians comfortably place him there based on civic laws. Because his father was an alderman during William's early childhood, the sons of town officials received free tuition. It defies logic to think an ambitious man like John Shakespeare would not utilize a free, highly prestigious education for his eldest son. When a modern listener hears grammar school, they picture gentle reading circles, but the reality of a tutor classroom was closer to a psychological boot camp. The educational model was built on rigorous, relentless, and often brutal rote memorization. The school day began at 6 in the morning and lasted until 5 p.m., 6 days a week. They were not studying math or science. The entire curriculum was centered almost exclusively on Latin. The goal was to produce young men who could navigate the legal, theological, and diplomatic worlds, all of which operated in Latin. They practiced something called double translation. A master would give the boys a passage in Latin, say, from the poet Ovid or the playwright Seneca. The boys had to translate it into English and then, hours later, translate their English back into Latin to see how closely they matched the original master's style. If you spend 10 hours a day twisting sentences back and forth between two entirely different grammatical structures, you learn how to stretch and bend language to your will, which totally explains the incredible linguistic flexibility we see later in the plays. They also learned rhetoric, practicing exercises called suasorii, where students had to take on the persona of a historical figure at a moment of crisis and argue a position. For example, you are Julius Caesar at the Rubicon. Argue why you should cross. This is the foundation of dramatic characterization. They were literally trained to inhabit different psychological viewpoints and argue them convincingly. You can actually see Shakespeare parodying his own grueling school days in his play, The Merry Wives of Windsor. He writes a scene where a heavily accented Welsh schoolmaster ruthlessly drills a young boy named William on his Latin grammar, layered with terrible bawdy puns. It is a brilliant glimpse into how deeply that classical training was beaten into him. That classical education gets abruptly derailed by reality. At age 18, the records show he marries a woman named Anne Hathaway. She is 26, a significant age gap for the period, but the circumstances of the marriage are even more pressing. The sources describe it as a profoundly hurried shotgun wedding. In late November 1582, they had to travel to the bishop's court to secure a special marriage license. To understand why this is a massive red flag, you have to understand the standard procedure for getting married in Elizabethan England, which was the reading of the banns. By law and church doctrine, if you wanted to marry, the local priest had to announce your intention to marry during the Sunday service for 3 consecutive weeks. It was a public security measure, giving the community 3 weeks to object if one of the parties was already married, underage, or closely related. Essentially the 16th century equivalent of a background check. But you could not read the banns during certain holy periods, and Advent was approaching. If William and Anne waited for the standard 3 weeks, they wouldn't be able to marry until the spring. They could not wait until the spring because Anne was already several months pregnant. The social stigma of an out-of-wedlock birth in a deeply religious, gossipy provincial town must have been terrifying, especially for a family that had already lost its social standing. So, William's family scrambles. Two friends of the Hathaway family sign a surety bond for £40, a massive sum of money at the time, to guarantee to the bishop that there were no legal impediments to the marriage. They basically post bail for the wedding, get the special license bypassing the banns, and marry in secret. 6 months later, in May of 1583, their first daughter Susanna is born. Barely 2 years after that, in early 1585, the parish registers show Anne giving birth to twins, Judith and Hamnet. Hamnet would tragically die at the age of 11, a loss that scholars believe deeply influenced the emotional weight of his later tragedies, most notably Hamlet. But looking at the timeline, the year 1585 is where we hit a massive, jarring narrative cliffhanger. He is 21 years old, has a wife and 3 infants, and his father is drowning in debt. And then the historical record goes completely dark. He vanishes. This is the period historians refer to as the Lost Years, stretching from 1585 to 1592. For 7 solid years, there is not a single tax record, property deed, legal dispute, or parish entry bearing his name. He simply ceases to exist on paper. If you look at human psychology, we absolutely despise a vacuum. When we don't have the facts, we invent mythology to fill the empty space. Reading through the sources detailing the theories of these lost years feels exactly like reading modern internet fan fiction. The most famous one is the poaching incident, the Sir Thomas Lucy theory. The story goes that a young, rebellious William was caught poaching deer and rabbits from the private estate of a powerful local magistrate named Sir Thomas Lucy. To escape severe physical punishment and imprisonment, William supposedly fled Stratford in the dead of night and ran away to London. It paints him as this swashbuckling, anti-authoritarian rogue, but the actual evidence is non-existent. This anecdote doesn't appear anywhere until 1709, nearly a century after his death, when it was published by an early biographer who was gathering local oral traditions and pub gossip. Furthermore, historians have checked the land records. Sir Thomas Lucy didn't even have a licensed deer park at his estate in Charlecote at that time, so he couldn't have poached deer that weren't there. It is a retrofitted origin story designed to make the poet look like a charismatic rebel. Then there is the second, incredibly popular theory, focusing on his arrival in London. The story claims he arrived completely penniless and destitute, and the only work he could find was standing outside the massive public playhouses, holding the horses of the wealthy aristocrats while they went inside to watch the plays. The horseholder myth goes further, claiming he established a monopoly on the business by hiring a gang of local street urchins known as Shakespeare's boys. It is the ultimate rags-to-riches bootstraps narrative, embellished in the 18th century by the writer Samuel Johnson because it fits the Dickensian archetype perfectly. But early modern theaters were located outside the city walls, in rough, chaotic suburbs like Shoreditch or Southwark. The idea that a highly educated 20-something provincial man with 3 children to support would spend years acting as a glorified valet in the mud is highly improbable. The theories get even stranger. Our sources mention the shake shaft theory, which pulls him completely out of the London theater scene and places him in the north of England. Scholars discovered a 1581 last will and testament belonging to a wealthy Catholic landowner in Lancashire named Alexander Houghton, who leaves money to a servant named William Shake Shaft, and specifically mentions passing on his collection of theatrical costumes and musical instruments. The leap in logic is that Shakespeare was hiding out in a Catholic household, working as a private schoolmaster and actor under an alias. However, genealogical research shows that Shakeshaft was an incredibly common surname in Lancashire at the time, making it very likely a coincidence with no hard documentary thread connecting the boy in Stratford to the servant in Lancashire. My absolute favorites, though, are the action hero theories, because his later plays demonstrate such a granular, highly specific knowledge of different professions. People assume he must have lived those lives. He knows exactly how to sail a ship in a storm, and the nautical terminology for rigging in Twelfth Night or The Tempest. He knows that the biscuits at the bottom of a barrel on a long sea voyage get infested with weevils, referring to them as remainder biscuits. Therefore, the theory goes he must have spent the lost years sailing the globe with the explorer Sir Francis Drake, or was a soldier fighting in the brutal wars in the Low Countries because he knows military siege tactics. The most cinematic theory posits he was operating as a covert secret agent, traveling through Italy with his later patron, the Earl of Southampton, to secure black market loans for Queen Elizabeth's government. This phenomenon reveals far more about the people inventing the theories than it does about the historical man. We suffer from a collective delusion that the biography of a genius must be inherently, continuously extraordinary. We refuse to accept that a person with a brilliant imagination can read a book about sailing, talk to a drunken sailor in a London pub, and then accurately write a scene about a shipwreck. We'd rather believe he was a Renaissance James Bond than just a guy looking for a paycheck. Let us ground this. An economic researcher proposes an explanation for the lost years that is incredibly boring by Hollywood standards, but logically, it makes the most sense. Remember John Shakespeare's illegal, highly lucrative black market wool business? Research suggests that it is highly probable William went to London, not as a runaway poacher or a destitute horse valet, but as a commercial proxy for his family's shadow business. London was the beating economic heart of the country. If your father is a major provincial wool broker whose local reputation is burned, he desperately needs a trusted, legally clean representative in the city to handle transactions, collect debts, and manage inventory. He translated moving illegal wool into becoming a theater mogul through a pivot fueled by capital. The London theater scene was exploding in the late 1580s. It was the tech startup boom of the 16th century. It is argued that William used the substantial profits generated from these commercial wool transactions to eventually buy his way into the playing companies. This explains a glaring mystery: how a provincial young man with no aristocratic backing could suddenly afford the expensive shares required to become a principal member of a highly competitive London theater troupe. It wasn't just raw artistic talent that got his foot in the door. It was cold, hard capital. The greatest writer in human history might have funded his artistic career by moving black market textiles and collecting on his father's illicit loans. But regardless of whether he arrived as a wool merchant, a runaway, or an agent, the timeline converges in 1592. Because in 1592, he is undeniably in London, and his sudden reappearance in the historical record is violent. He reappears not with a celebrated publication, but as the target of a vicious, jealous smear campaign by a rival playwright. Let us unpack the social dynamics of the London literary scene at this moment, because it was heavily stratified. The rival who attacked him, Robert Greene, belonged to a clique of highly educated, fiercely arrogant young men known as the University Wits, which included writers like Thomas Nash, Christopher Marlowe, and George Peele. They held degrees from Oxford and Cambridge, viewed themselves as the rightful inheritors of the classical tradition, and essentially monopolized the London stage in the 1580s. Their primary weapon was blank verse, an unrhymed poetry written in iambic pentameter that sounds like a heartbeat. Christopher Marlowe had revolutionized the theater by using it to give characters a soaring, majestic, almost godlike way of speaking. The university wits believed this sophisticated poetic structure belonged exclusively to classically trained elites. Enter William Shakespeare, a man armed only with a grammar school education and a provincial accent, writing plays that are pulling massive crowds and making an absolute fortune. Greene is furious. In 1592, from his deathbed, Greene publishes a pamphlet called Greene's Groatsworth of Wit, directly attacking Shakespeare by calling him an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers. The insult is incredibly layered. It implies he is a scavenger, a mimic stealing the intellectual property and poetic styles of the university-educated writers. But Greene does not stop there. He delivers one of the most famous literary burns in history, calling him a tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide. This is a brilliant, mocking misquote of Shakespeare's own play, Henry VI, Part 3, where a character insults the ruthless Queen Margaret with the dramatic line, "O tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide." Greene takes that specific line, twists it, and throws it back at him, outraged that a mere player, a common entertainer, has the sheer audacity to think he can write blank verse as well as the educated masters. It is the Elizabethan equivalent of a diss track, an attempt to completely cancel him. But Shakespeare does not retreat back to Stratford. He leans into the business and doubles down. This resilience brings us to the year 1599 and the creation of the ultimate theatrical startup, the Globe Theatre. The genesis of the Globe is where Shakespeare's dual identity, the visionary artist and the ruthless businessman, perfectly synthesizes, and it begins with a massive real estate dispute. The playing company Shakespeare belonged to, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, performed in a building simply called the Theatre, built on land owned by a man named Giles Allen. When the lease on the land expired, Allen refused to renew it, planning to tear the building down and sell the timber. The playing company was desperate and without a venue, so they executed one of the most audacious heists in theatrical history. During the Christmas holiday in 1598, while Giles Allen was out of town, the acting company hired a master carpenter, snuck onto the property in the dead of night, and completely dismantled the massive wooden theater, timber by timber. Legally, they owned the wood, but not the land, so they effectively stole their own building. They carried these massive oak beams across the frozen River Thames to the South Bank, an area outside the jurisdiction of the strict city authorities, and used that stolen timber to construct a magnificent brand new venue, the Globe. The physical construction was wild, but the financial mechanism behind it changed everything. The surviving historical sources include the actual 1599 tripartite legal lease for the land, signed by the landowner Nicholas Brend, the leading actors Richard and Cuthbert Burbage, and 5 regular actors, including William Shakespeare. They created a joint stock company. Before this moment, playwrights were gig workers who would sell a script to a company for a flat fee, usually around £6, and once the transaction was done, the writer saw no royalties, no matter how popular the play became. The Globe was radically different because the actors themselves funded the construction of the building and owned the profits. Shakespeare wasn't just a hired pen. He was a founding partner who owned a 12.5% share in the physical building and the company's overarching profits. Every single time a person paid admission, Shakespeare received a direct cut. We literally see the birth of the term box office here. Audiences entering the theater would drop their pennies into physical locked ceramic boxes held by gatherers. When full, They were taken to a secure room, the box office, to be smashed open and counted. Shakespeare was leveraging his equity in those pennies to become staggeringly wealthy. The building designed to capture those pennies was an architectural marvel, a massive, 3-story, polygonal amphitheater, roughly 100 feet in diameter, that could hold an astonishing 3,000 people at a single time. The social stratification of Elizabethan London was built directly into its floor plan. If you were poor, you paid a single penny to be a groundling, standing shoulder to shoulder in the open-air dirt yard at the very base of the stage with no seats and no roof to protect you from the rain. They were incredibly rowdy. Archaeological excavators digging at the site of the globe found literal mountains of fossilized hazelnut shells, left behind by groundlings cracking nuts, drinking ale, and throwing orange peels at the actors if they didn't like the pacing of a scene. Meanwhile, the wealthy merchants and nobles paid up to 5 pennies to sit in the cushioned, covered galleries above. If you were truly aristocratic, you paid even more to sit in the lords' rooms directly over the stage, not because it offered the best view of the play, but because it offered the rest of the audience the best view of you. The theater was a place to be seen. The stage itself was just as complex, a multi-level machine highly sophisticated for its era. It featured a massive painted canopy over it called the Heavens, decorated with the zodiac and stars, hiding pulleys and ropes that allowed actors playing classical gods or spirits to be dramatically lowered onto the stage. Below the floorboards was the Hell, built with multiple heavy trapdoors, where actors playing ghosts, like the ghost of Hamlet's father, or demons could suddenly burst upward amidst smoke and fireworks. It was a deeply immersive sensory assault that occasionally went horribly wrong, leading to the disaster of 1613. The company was performing Henry VIII, a play full of royal pomp and circumstance, and for a special effect, they fired off a real theatrical cannon, loaded with gunpowder and wadding, but no cannonball. When it misfired, a flaming piece of the wadding shot upward and landed squarely on the highly flammable thatched roof of the galleries. Built of dry timber and thatch, the entire globe burned to the dirt in less than 2 hours. Miraculously, amidst the panic of 3,000 people fleeing through narrow exits, there were no fatalities. Contemporary letters from eyewitnesses note one incredibly specific, visceral detail. A man's breeches caught on fire, and he was only saved from severe burns because a bystander had the quick thinking to pour an entire bottle of ale down his pants to extinguish the flames. It feels like a scene ripped straight out of one of his comedies. Despite the fire, the financial machine kept turning. They rebuilt the globe immediately, and Shakespeare took this immense London wealth and funneled it systematically back into Stratford. Here we see his ultimate goal. He wasn't trying to be a bohemian artist. He was trying to restore his family's honor. With his theater dividends, he bought a property called New Place, the second largest, finest house in all of Stratford-upon-Avon, made of expensive brick with sprawling gardens. He didn't stop with real estate. He bought massive tracts of local farmland and purchased the legal right to collect local tithes, guaranteeing him a passive income for decades. Most revealingly, he used his wealth to navigate the College of Arms, and in 1596 succeeded in securing an official coat of arms for his father, John, the disgraced mayor. The coat of arms featured a falcon shaking a spear with the motto, "Not without right," officially elevating his family to the status of gentlemen and leaving their common tradesman roots behind. This incredible duality, the ruthless, litigious real estate tycoon suing his neighbors over minor debts while simultaneously writing King Lear and probing the deepest philosophical corners of the human soul, creates a massive cognitive dissonance. That specific disbelief leads us to the most controversial topic in our entire stack of sources: the authorship controversy, the centuries-old anti-Stratfordian conspiracy theory that the man from Stratford was a total fraud. To approach this objectively, we must analyze the exact arguments the skeptics construct. They look at the surviving historical record and point to perceived glaring, impossible voids, such as the low survival rate of intimate personal documents. We have his business records and tax evasions, but not a single personal letter or original handwritten manuscript of the plays. They point to his last will and testament, noting that it meticulously lists bowls and beds, but never mentions a massive library of books. However, the core pillar of their argument is socioeconomic. How could a man from a dirty sheep-trading town, who never attended a university or traveled to the royal courts of Italy, intimately understand the complex inner workings of international diplomacy, aristocratic politics, and aristocratic sports like falconry and tennis? Believing the glovemaker's son is disqualified, they propose a roster of alternative candidates who possess the noble blood, the university degrees, and the foreign passports. Sir Francis Bacon, a brilliant philosopher heavily promoted in the 19th century, was believed to have embedded hidden cryptograms and secret ciphers into the poetry to secretly claim authorship, as his supporters felt the plays contained complex legal knowledge only a high-ranking official would know. The modern favorite is Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, driven by the theory that a high-ranking nobleman could not publicly associate his name with the lowly, disreputable public theaters, and therefore used the actor William Shakespeare as a convenient, paid frontman. The darkest spy thriller of a theory belongs to Christopher Marlowe, suggesting the brilliant rival playwright didn't actually die in a bar brawl in 1593, but faked his own death to escape heresy charges, fled the country, and continued to send brilliant plays back to London under a pseudonym. These are compelling narratives, but the entire anti-Stratfordian argument rests on the fundamentally flawed assumption that a writer's fiction must perfectly mirror their lived reality. Demanding that a playwright must have visited Italy to write about Verona is like assuming a science fiction author must have actually traveled to Mars to write about a Martian colony. The entire purpose of writing is empathy, imagination, and research. If you sit in a London tavern, reading imported books and talking to traveling ambassadors, you can write a play about a king. The academic consensus is overwhelmingly unified. William Shakespeare of Stratford wrote the plays bearing his name. Historians systematically dismantle the skeptical arguments by contextualizing them within early modern realities. The lack of personal letters and manuscripts looks like a cover-up to a modern mind. But in the 16th century, paper was an incredibly expensive, handmade commodity that was constantly recycled. Printers literally used play manuscripts to bind other books or wrap pies, and there was no concept of archiving a playwright's drafts, because plays were viewed as disposable, lowbrow entertainment, not sacred literature. The lack of books in his will is easily explained by legal norms. Books were valuable commodities that would not be individually listed, but rather grouped under the overarching category of goods and chattels that passed to his main heir, Susanna, or his working library, simply remained in London with the playing company. The most devastating counter-argument to the conspiracy theories is the sheer volume of contemporary witnesses. The idea that nobody knew he was a writer during his lifetime is an entirely false fabrication. There is a vast mountain of contemporary recognition. Ben Jonson, his greatest literary rival and friend, explicitly praises him, referring to him directly as the sweet swan of Avon. William Camden, one of the most highly respected, rigorous historians of the period, includes Shakespeare in a published list of the best writers in England. The ultimate proof is the monumental publication of 1623, the first folio, 7 years after his death. Two of his closest fellow actors, John Heminges and Henry Condell, undertook a massive, grueling financial project to compile and publish 36 of his plays in a single volume. A folio was an enormous, staggeringly expensive format of book exclusively reserved for heavy theology, royal decrees, or massive histories. To print the collected works of a mere playwright in a folio format was unprecedented. It was a monument to their friend. In the introductory text of the folio, they explicitly named their deceased colleague, William Shakespeare of Stratford, as the author. If the documentary evidence and logic are completely sound, why does this conspiracy theory stubbornly persist among brilliant minds like Sigmund Freud, Mark Twain, and Charlie Chaplin? This raises a fascinating sociological question about how we interact with history. The authorship controversy did not exist in the 16th or 17th centuries. It took off in the mid-19th century, driven heavily by figures like Delia Bacon, and it stems from profound, ingrained Victorian-class snobbery. The Victorians had elevated Shakespeare to the level of a secular god, and when they looked at the historical reality that this god was the son of a disgraced wool smuggler, that he sued his neighbors over small bags of malt, that he lacked a university degree, they recoiled. They didn't like the mud. They suffered from an elitist assumption that true genius is an inherited trait of the aristocracy, simply unable to fathom that a working-class, provincial grammar school boy possessed the psychological depth to capture the human condition so perfectly. Presenting this objectively, the authorship question is less about Shakespeare's history and entirely about how modern societies project their own class biases and rigid expectations onto the past. We desperately want our heroes to fit a neat aristocratic mold. But the reality of this man, the provincial hustler counting his pennies in the mud of the Globe Theatre, leveraging his terrifying intellect to conquer the city, is infinitely more impressive than a bored earl writing poetry in a castle. Having conquered London, survived the fires, and amassed a sprawling financial empire, he eventually decides he has had enough, bringing us to the final, fiercely debated act of his life. Having conquered London, survived the fires, the plagues, and the literary rivalries, he eventually decides he has had enough and retires. He leaves the daily operations of the London Theatre and returns permanently to live out his days at New Place in Stratford as a wealthy, respected gentleman. He passes away on April 23, 1616, and is buried in the chancel of Holy Trinity Church, an honor reserved for prominent tithe holders. But the drama does not end with his burial. It continues in his last will and testament, where we have to examine the most infamous, hotly debated private decision of his life. In his highly detailed will, he leaves the vast bulk of his massive estate, the properties, the lands, the wealth, to his eldest daughter, Susanna. But he includes a very specific, almost jarringly precise bequest to his wife, Anne Hathaway, leaving her his second-best bed with the furniture. For centuries, biographers have stared at that single sentence and constructed an entire tragic narrative around it. To modern ears, leaving your widow the second best of anything feels like a cold, calculated, passive-aggressive snub from beyond the grave, as if he is publicly humiliating her. It sounds terrible if you apply 21st century emotional standards to a 17th century legal document, but historical context completely shatters that interpretation. First, we need to define the terminology. In the 1600s, furniture did not mean wooden nightstands and a dresser. It referred to the bed's textiles, the heavy velvet curtains, the intricately embroidered valances, the canopy, the feather mattresses, and the linen sheets. In early modern England, textiles were astronomically expensive. A fully furnished bed was often the single most valuable item in a house, sometimes worth more than the physical wooden frame of the house itself, making it a major financial asset. But why the second best? You have to understand how houses functioned as complex status symbols in a highly stratified society. In a wealthy manor like New Place, the best bed was almost never slept in by the owners. It was a showpiece kept downstairs in a parlor or a designated guest room, specifically to display the family's immense wealth to important visitors for public consumption. It is exactly like the fancy living room couch that a grandmother wraps in thick plastic purely for company. Therefore, by process of elimination, the second best bed was the bed in the master bedroom, the actual marital bed. It was the intimate space where William and Anne slept together for decades, and almost certainly the bed where their 3 children were conceived, and perhaps where Hamnet passed away. Projecting modern emotional baggage onto a document from 400 years ago is exactly like an archaeologist digging up a standard prenuptial agreement 1,000 years from now and concluding the couple despised each other. Furthermore, by English common law, Anne was already automatically entitled to a widow's portion, 1/3 of his estate, and the right to remain living in New Place for the rest of her life. She didn't need the house explicitly left to her because she already had it, explicitly passing down a deeply personal, luxurious heirloom like the marital bed wasn't a snub. It was an act of profound sentimental affection and intimacy, a romantic gesture codified in law that completely rewrites the narrative of a loveless marriage. The man dies in 1616, leaves his wife the bed they shared, leaves his daughters a financial empire, and is buried. But here is the most baffling part of this entire journey. The god of literature we know today wasn't truly born until decades later. How did a popular, commercially successful playwright metamorphose into a global, untouchable religion? The metamorphosis is a historical process scholars call bardolatry, the idolatry of the bard. Shakespeare was not immediately viewed as a sacred, untouchable genius. Following his death, the Puritans gained political power and completely banned all theater in 1642, viewing it as sinful, and literally dismantled the buildings. When the monarchy was restored in 1660 and the theaters reopened, the new generation of playwrights and theater managers, like William Davenant and Nahum Tate, didn't treat Shakespeare's folios as holy scripture. They treated them as messy, outdated, raw material, and completely butchered the texts. They systematically rewrote the plays to fit the newly refined tastes of the Restoration Court. They looked at masterpieces like Macbeth and King Lear and decided the heavy tragedy needed more singing, a chorus line of dancing witches, and a happy ending. They cut characters they found tedious and modernized the poetry because they thought Elizabethan English sounded barbaric. Famously, Nahum Tate rewrote King Lear so that the tragic ending is entirely erased. Lear survives, regains his throne, and the heroine Cordelia marries Edgar in a joyous romantic finale. For over a century, that happy version was the only one audiences saw. It is exactly like a massive modern movie studio buying beloved comic book intellectual property, rewriting the lore to test better with focus groups, injecting a romance plot, and heavily marketing it into a billion-dollar cinematic universe. Shakespeare was highly adaptable IP. The physical way the plays were viewed also changed with the introduction of proscenium scenery. The Globe was a thrust stage, an open platform surrounded by the audience on 3 sides with no painted backgrounds, where actors described the setting using the poetry. The Restoration introduced the proscenium arch, the picture frame stage with elaborate, painted movable scenery. This architectural shift meant they had to chop up Shakespeare's fluid scenes to allow time for stagehands to physically change the heavy painted backdrops. The technology literally changed the text. This highly adaptable IP finally transformed into the untouchable, rigid national monument we revere today in 1769. The most famous actor of the 18th century, David Garrick, orchestrated a massive, unprecedented event called the Shakespeare Jubilee in Stratford-upon-Avon. It was essentially a 3-day carnival of absolute adoration, interestingly, without a single scene of his plays actually being performed. Instead, Garrick commissioned soaring odes to the poet's genius, funded the erection of statues, and sold massive amounts of souvenirs carved from a mulberry tree, supposedly planted by Shakespeare himself. It was a brilliant, highly calculated public relations stunt that fundamentally transformed Shakespeare from a respected, adaptable, historical writer into a mystical national cult figure. The Victorians in the 19th century then took Garrick's PR stunt and weaponized it. As the British Empire expanded globally, the Victorian cult of Shakespeare cemented him as the ultimate pillar of English identity, an imperial tool. His works were exported and taught not just as plays, but as the absolute pinnacle of human morality, philosophy, and linguistic perfection. Over the span of 3 centuries, Shakespeare the man, the woolbrogger's son, the litigious, debt-collecting businessman, the collaborator, was entirely erased and replaced by Shakespeare the product. His true legacy isn't just the millions of words he wrote before 1616. His legacy is a massive, relentless, collaborative effort spanning over 400 years. Directors who rewrote him, actors who reinterpreted him, critics who elevated him, and politicians who utilized him have constantly reinvented his identity. The ultimate mark of his genius might not just be the raw poetry, but the fact that he created psychological frameworks so robust and deeply human that they can survive being completely dismantled and rebuilt by every single generation that follows. He created a mirror, and for 4 centuries, every era, from the Restoration to the Victorians to modern Hollywood, has looked into that text and seen its own anxieties, its own politics, and its own values reflecting back. We have traced an incredible, chaotic trajectory today. He was not a delicate lord, descending from a castle with a golden quill. He was a provincial tradesman's son who survived his family's financial ruin. He was a hustler in the cutthroat, dangerous London theater scene, a brilliant, occasionally ruthless real estate investor, and an artist whose complex life became a blank screen for the world to project its own biases onto. This leaves us with a highly provocative thought, moving beyond the historical authorship debates. Today, we obsessively debate whether an artificial intelligence can create true art. If an AI writes a play tomorrow that perfectly captures the tragedy of the human condition with stunning poetry and profound empathy, does it matter that a machine wrote it? If the art moves you to tears, does the biography of the author actually matter? The centuries of conspiracy theories surrounding Shakespeare suggest that for us, the art is never enough. We are deeply, fundamentally obsessed with the human struggle behind the creation. We demand a genius we can define. We want the ghost in the machine. It makes you realize that when we argue about history, we are usually just arguing about ourselves. If this journey shifted your perspective on the man behind the myth, do not let the conversation stop here. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment below with your thoughts on his legacy, and share this audio with the biggest history, theater, or literature nerd you know. Keep questioning the past with us, right here on Legendary Lives Unveiled.